I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to another special episode of Postcards from a Dying World. This is a big one with two returning guests. Both my guests have been on the podcast before, but okay, you guys have been yelling at me. I've gotten a lot of comments about when am I going to continue the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series. And of course, if you don't know, if this is the first time for whatever reason, I'm covering every story in this here book, the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, one at a time, and this is number 13, Scanners Live in Vain by Cordwainer Smith. So last time we were here, we talked about First Contact by Murray Leinster, and we're now into the 1940s/50s because this story, well written in 1945, was published in 1950. But we'll get to that story in a little bit. I just got a little bit of business before I introduce our guests. I have a couple appearances coming up. If you listen to this on day of, you'll have time to catch me in Los Angeles at the Speculative Fiction Across Media Conference. And if you don't make it this year to the Speculative Fiction Across Media Conference, that's okay. But I want to promote this conference to people because it's my favorite conference of the year. It's sci-fi academics from all over the world convening on Monterey Park in LA. And doing papers and presentations. And last year, I just had an amazing time. And this year, I will be doing a panel on Severance, the show Severance. I'll be moderating a panel with some really awesome panelists, including Cheryl Vint, the author of The History of Science Fiction, will be on that panel. And then I am presenting a paper called what is it called? Philip K. Dick and Empathy: The Artificial Humans and Animal Rights of Philip K. Dick. So it's a paper on robots and animal rights involving the work of Philip K. Dick. There's a whole lot of talk about how empathy is a theme that weaves through his entire oeuvre. And I'm very excited to present that paper. I've been working on it off and on for a year since they announced that artificial intelligence would be the theme this year for SFAM. So if you don't make it to SFAM this year, keep your eye out for next year. It's going to happen every September in Los Angeles, and it's a really cool conference. And then on October 18th, I will be tabling with the Horror Writers Association at the Verbatim Book Fair in San Diego, which is one of the best book fairs on the West Coast. It's right in the heart of North Park and San Diego, and it has some of the best attendance. It's incredible book fair. And I will be selling copies of The Last Night to Kill Nazis and my new novel, Great America and Dead World. So I'd love to see people there, and we'll have the whole crew from the San Diego HWA, and we'll be signing copies of Dread Coast, our new anthology of locals that benefits victims of the Palisades fire. So that's all the business. Now, listen, I had these two people in mind for this panel once I announced the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series 13 episodes ago. And that's because Cordwainer Smith is an author that was on my radar because of Brian Evenson. Brian was a guest on the Dickheads podcast talking about Walter Miller's Canticle for Leibowitz. And at the end, I said, Brian, are there any writers that you think Dickheads should check out that maybe we don't know? And you responded, Cordwainer Smith. And I went and bought every Cordwainer Smith book I could after that and worked my way through them. But Scanners Live in Vain is, of course, his ultimate classic. So we'll get to that in a minute. But one of the reasons why you guys are a great combination, Duncan B. Barlow, And Brian Evenson is because you're both great short story writers. You're two of my favorite short story writers. And Duncan just released this book, Awry, which is his short story collection. And so let me start with Duncan. Duncan, tell the folks who you are and what you do. You are the author of several books. You teach writing. Tell the folks who you are.
Sure. Thanks, David. What a lovely introduction. My name's Duncan Barlow. I am a writer of fiction. I have some books out there, some short stories circulating in the world of journals. I am oh boy, word just disappeared on me there. I
I'm not
am,
having the best time with words tonight either.
yeah,
We're just
yeah,
gonna
you'd
have fun here.
think writers would have a better time with this. Publisher, that's the word I was looking for. Publisher at Astrophil Press at University of South Dakota, and I managing editor at South Dakota Review.
And of all the writers that I have on this podcast, Duncan is probably the one I've known the longest. We've known each other for, I think, since we were both in high school doing punk rock things. We were a couple cities apart from each other, but that's how punk rock is. Uh, we became
Yeah.
friends. And so I've known Duncan for probably longer than we want to admit. Let's not talk about the actual number of years. Um, Brian Evenson is the author of this book, Immobility. This is probably my favorite Evenson book, but he is one of my favorite authors of short stories. Brian, tell the folks who you are, what you do.
Okay. First, I want to make a pitch for Awry, Duncan's book, which I think is a really terrific story collection.
Hell
And
yeah, it's
yeah,
great.
so I encourage you all to take a look at that.
Thanks,
So
Brian.
you're welcome. I'm Brian Evenson. I am the author of almost 2 dozen books of fiction at this point. The most recent one is called Good Night, Sleep Tight, which is up for a World Fantasy Award. I teach at Cal Arts. Won the Shirley Jackson Prize, the World Fantasy Award, been a finalist for the Edgar Award. And my work is kind of has a foot in science fiction, a foot in horror, a foot in literary fiction, and then like a fourth or fifth foot somewhere else.
Right. And now both these gentlemen have been on the podcast before. Brian on this one, he's been on Dickheads multiple times. But he came on this podcast to talk about, I think it was the Glassy Burning Floor of Hell, your short story
I think
collection.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and we went deep on those short stories, and I highly recommend that book. And combining it with, we got really into the weeds of how those stories were constructed. And Duncan and I did a very long discussion about writing with learning disabilities because we're both dyslexic. And I highly encourage people to check out that conversation because we definitely got into the weeds about writing and kind of both of our journey coping with dyslexia and our learning disability. So I highly recommend people go check that out. But we are here today to talk about Cordwainer Smith, who, by the way, doesn't exist, sort of, because it's the pen name of a man named Paul A. Lineberger. And we're going to get into his history and all that. But what you should know is that we are covering Scanners Live in Vain, which is the 13th story in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. If you have not listened to this series before, these stories were selected by the members of the Science Fiction Writers Association in the late 60s. The writers chose these stories, voted on them, and the top vote getters were put in this book. Robert Silverberg added 2 stories himself, but most of these were selected by the writers. So these are very popular stories. If you have not listened to the earlier episodes, you can go back and read the whole book and follow along with what we're doing. And I have 2 guests each time, 2 or 3 guests who each bring something to the table when we talk about them. But I always kind of start off with the history of the writer and the story. And so guys, I'm going to do a lot of talking the next little bit, but once we get into the story, but break in at any point if you want to talk, react to the history. Now, Brian, did you know the backstory of Cordwainer Smith before the first time you read him? And maybe since you're the one that's read him the longest, maybe you want to tell us where you discovered Cordwainer Smith.
Yeah, I can't, I think I was at a World Fantasy a conference and someone mentioned him and I was like, his name is great, Cordwainer Smith.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, how have I not heard of this guy? And then someone was talking about how good he was, and I just picked him up and started looking at him, and I thought he was really interesting. And there's a kind of big volume that collects all of his stories that I think it was the science fiction writers. I can't remember who put it out, but someone like it's part of a series that it just collects a bunch of science fiction writers. And I just went through that volume and really loved the stories, loved to see how he was developing. It was maybe China Mieville actually who first mentioned him in passing, and then someone else at I can't even remember who at World Fantasy talked
Mhm.
about him. And then it was only after the fact that I realized that it was a pseudonym, that his name was Paul Linebarger, and that he was really a weird, interesting person. He wrote, as you'll probably say, I'll let you say it. Yeah.
Well, we'll get into his history and where he came from because even his childhood is very, very, very interesting. I don't
Hmm.
know how much you know about his childhood, but and one of the reasons why I wanted to bring Duncan on for this too is that well, we are both big genre readers and we're people who both dive into the history of science fiction from the very beginning. I thought it'd be interesting to get Duncan's perspective because Duncan, you're not the big giant like read everything from the genre writers nerds that Brian and I are, because Brian and I are both two guys who love to like once we get a nugget of these sci-fi writers, we dig into everything, and I know that's something that both Brian and I are kind of there for. But
Yeah,
so this was your first time ever. I'm assuming this was your first time ever hearing about him, right?
yeah, and there's definitely some science fiction authors that I did the deep dive on over time. I mean, Philip K. Dick, I think we all kind of end up there at some point and read
Right.
everything. But yeah, no, I had never even heard of this story until you
Hmm.
you approached me about doing the podcast. But it was delightful to read.
Yeah, and we will get to the story in a little bit. But and since you didn't know anything about him, all this history is going to be new to you and it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, you're doing
So,
the work for me.
yeah, so Paul Lineberger was a famous professor and he was a noted professor in the and he was a scholar of not English. He didn't teach science fiction. He taught East Asian politics and history, and he was a scholar for all things East Asia. Okay, and he was also an expert in, of all things, psychological warfare. And that has to do with his experience serving in World War II, which we'll get to in a little bit. But his history with one of his interests and his interest in Asia came from his childhood. Brian, did you know about his father and that whole experience?
I knew his father was lived over there, and wasn't his godfather uh I can't remember who it was, but it was an important Chinese figure, was like a godfather to him, right?
Yeah, Sun Yat-sen,
Yeah,
who his father was a diplomat in
right,
China.
right.
So Paul was born in Milwaukee, but his
Which is
mother
the
went
China
back.
of the US. I mean, let's be frank.
Yeah, yeah. And she went back specifically to Milwaukee to the States to make sure he was born in the States so he could have the potential to be president. That was what actually their argument for like why she went back. And so the Far East Studies thing was kind of like a natural thing, but the Sun Yun Sat was a revolutionary in China, and he was one of the military leaders that fought against the Japanese.
Yeah.
And so he was like an important political figure in China, and he was Paul Lineberger's godfather.
Hmm.
Yeah, he was steeped in this stuff. He had his PhD by the time he was 23 years old, which is pretty early, I think.
I think it
Um,
is. Yeah.
yeah, and when he was drafted, or when so one of the differences in how a lot of the writers of this generation were kind of dealing, with World War II, um, so many of the writers actually either went to war. Think of your Kurt Vonnegut's and Richard Matheson, who were on opposite ends of the Dresden bombings, which is like a really fascinating thing. But Paul Lineberger's experience was when he got sent over, he was put into a unit that was developing methods of psychological warfare to combat the Nazis. And so he ended up writing a book on the Journal of Psychological Warfare. So he wrote a handbook using Nazis as an experience, which I'm sure he would be pretty horrified to find out how that book was used in Vietnam after his death. But all these tactics that have you read that book, Brian?
I picked it up and I've read bits of it, but I haven't read it all the way through. I mean, for me, it's fascinating because for years it was the manual that the military used in terms of thinking about psychological warfare. And so that's been something I've always, tried to think about in relation to him, because I like his stories, but it's also like, I mean, I mean, it's a little hard to kind of put those two things together, like the science fiction stories, and also was a master of psychological warfare.
Right. And that colors for me, knowing that history colors all of my reading of his fiction. I don't know how you feel, but I'm
Yeah.
always thinking about it a little bit in the back of my head. And so I did my deep dive on Cordwainer Smith um, a year ago, January. And so what I did is I read The Instrumentality of Mankind, his collection.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I read The Planet Buyer, which was eventually, I think I have my copy of that one here too. I have a really hilarious old copy. This one was nominated for the Hugo, The
Yeah.
Planet Buyer, which was expanded into a longer novel called Australia.
Yeah.
So I read both versions, which kind of felt stupid towards the end because a lot of it was the same. And then I read the psychological warfare book at the end of it. And I'd love to say it was a really exciting read. Um, it wasn't, but it was interesting. And I will say, because a lot of the tactics were in relation to fighting Nazis, I will say there has been a little bit of an influence on my sequel to The Last Night to Kill Nazis. And there
Oh,
is
cool.
a direct homage to Paul Lineberger in there. But I don't want to go further because the book will be coming out from Clash Books in the near future. But yeah, it's a really fascinating history. The fact that he was this expert in psychological warfare is just that's a very unique thing in a science fiction writer.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah, and his whole history, with he was a very noted professor at John Hopkins. He was very well respected in his field. So the whole Cordwainer Smith thing was he was worried that writing the pulp fiction would affect um, his academic career. And so he had come up with the name Cordwainer Smith very early on. He was very young when he published his first science fiction. And in fact, his very first science fiction he published when he was a teenager. And let me see, I got the history here. I'm used to
Hmm.
having my desk, but so he had a story that's in The Instrumentality of Mankind that was called War Number 81/Q. And it was really originally published in 1928, which, by the way, is the year that the term science fiction was coined. And the science fiction movement was only 2 years old at the time.
Hmm.
So the first issue of Amazing Stories was published in 1926. We'll be celebrating the 100th anniversary of the science fiction movement next year. And so 1928, he published War Number 81/Q. It was not republished until after his death in the Instrumentality of Mankind collection. And he was 15 years old. So first published story 19 or when he was 15 years old, 1928, and it was a Washington D.C. schools publication. So all the stories were written by students in the Washington D.C. schools. And here's the amazing thing about it: if you read it, it does not come off as a juvenile, right, or like something written by a 15-year-old. It's a very good short story, but especially if you know the history of when it was written, it's really fascinating. And you can see that part of his world building, by the way, too, is really affected by the fact that he was traveling overseas with his father, and then he had these experiences in East Asia. And so, and one of my favorite pieces of world building that happens in the story Scanners Live in Vain is because it takes place in the very far future. I love that he has a character saying something about airplanes, and he says, well, airplanes were good enough for Confucius.
Right.
Right. And
Yeah.
showing just like how far in the future it is that they just get all this wrong. It's so subtle and so brilliant and so perfect, but also showing that he was thinking of Chinese culture having a huge impact on our future.
I like too how he just kind of refuses to explain. He just kind of lets you, he throws you into the story and just you kind of figure it out as you go in terms of what's happening. And yeah.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
all the stories. So, and I do want to recommend War Number 81/Q as kind of just seeing what this 15-year-old Cordwainer Smith was doing. I think it's the second story in the Instrumentality of Mankind. This collection is pretty crucial. And what this collection does is that a lot of the short stories that Cordwainer Smith wrote kind of all happen in this far future timeline set in the same universe with what he calls the Instrumentality of Mankind, which is like his basically his federation in Cordwainer Smith language. And so this one is kind of really important, and I highly recommend that people get it. And it has this really cool cover for those of you watching on YouTube with the people ballooning on Venus, which, hey, it was the 50s. Come on. Which is great. I don't remember
Hot
which
new
story.
indie band.
Yeah, ballooning on Venus. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And this collection was released from Del Rey. It's pretty easy to find used. I'm not sure if it's been reissued, but this one's pretty easy to find. And yeah, I ran out and got it after Brian Evenson told me to when we were talking about Canticle for Leibowitz. And I highly recommend also that episode of the Dickheads podcast, because everybody should read Canticle for Leibowitz anyways. I'm just putting
That's a
it
great book too. Yeah.
out there. Yeah, so he in his political career, he briefed the Joint Chiefs Staff and JFK. He actually was in briefings a couple years before his death about like what a quagmire Vietnam could be for those folks that were thinking about going over there. And but he died in the 60s. So we have a very small amount of Cordwainer Smith. And in fact, we really only have 1.5 novels from Cordwainer Smith, because we have the Planet Buyer and the expanded version of Nostralia. So if I would just say, don't do what I did and read both. Just read Nostralia. And then there's a collection called the Space Lords, and then this Instrumentality of Mankind. And you can buy entire collections of the short stories, but there's not a lot. But let me tell you, he was a huge influence in the short amount of time that he was there, and many authors will point to him as being one of the best to ever write science fiction. And Scanners Live in Vain was his second published story after War number 81/Q. And every time I say that story name, I'm going to say the whole thing. So this was his second published story. So I don't know how much science fiction he wrote and rejected, or how much science fiction that he kind of like played with and that didn't publish. But between 1928 and 1945, he did not publish any other science fiction. He was doing other things. He was doing academics. But in 1945, shortly after the end of the war, he wrote Scanners Live in Vain. This story lived um, uh, in his or as a manuscript for 5 years before it was published in 1950 in Fantasy Book, which was a low circulation zine. So this story originally was published in a zine. But one of the other stories in that issue was by Frederick Paul. Now, if you don't know who Frederick Paul is, he's one of the most important writers and editors of science fiction of the 20th century. He was one of the Futurians that hung out with Isaac Asimov, and he was married to Judith Merrill, and he edited and published many anthologies and was the second editor for Galaxy magazine, of course, one of the most important science fiction magazines. But it was Paul who read the story. When he read the story in the zine, he I'm sorry, hold on, let me thank you, Duncan. All right. So it was Paul in 1952, 2 years after the original publication. He did an anthology called Beyond the End of Time. And Beyond the End of Time, he asked Cordwainer Smith if he could buy Scanners Live in Vain to be republished in that anthology. And that's the anthology where the story took off, where people started to notice him. And then he started to get invites to magazines, and actually, I believe, was also agented through SMLA. And at that point, he started this kind of secret science fiction career. He's not the only one. Of course, another famous, Alice Sheldon, of course, had an entire career as James Tiptree Jr. In fact, most people, and famously, I believe it was Silverberg who made himself look like a giant ass by saying there's no possible way that James Tiptree Jr. could be a woman when the theory started to go around. But there was a long time where no one knew who Cordwainer Smith was. He did not go to conventions. He did not do the normal fan things. But when he did show up towards the end of his life in the early 60s, he was treated with massive respect, and everyone was very excited to meet him. And he also gushed over meeting certain writers. And there's a real famous story about him and Heinlein having like a very long conversation. And it was interesting because they're so different politically and come from different backgrounds. It just seemed an interesting connection. But let's talk about the story now. So I'm sorry, this is the part where I'm done talking a whole bunch, and I'll get your feedback. Brian, do you want to give people your thumbnail of what you? How would you describe the plot of Scanners Live in Vain?
I'm trying to figure out how to do that without either saying too much or too little or giving too much away.
But we're going to assume that everyone here has a chance to read it. We're going to spoil it.
So. Okay. All right. We're going to spoil it. That's good. Well, so it's about someone who is a scanner. We don't initially know what a scanner is, but we learn that what they are is a human who has had a lot of their senses disconnected from their body, so that they can kind of be, I don't think we ever quite know the mechanism for it, but they can kind of be projected into space and occupy these bodies of these convicts that have been kind of cleaned out, right?
Right.
And control them. And for whatever reason, because of the way space travel works, at least so far, that's the only way people can kind of be awakened in space. So other people are frozen, but the scanners are these people who have kind of sacrificed themselves to help other people kind of move from planet to planet, and also to kind of control these convicts and kind of just make things happen. So they live in this kind of split space where most of the time they're not in their bodies, and then every once in a while, a few days a month, they come back and occupy their bodies and kind of have their senses, have their life, but it only lasts for a little while.
And it has the
Um,
awesome name of cranching.
yes, they cranch. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But this is a story about a group of scanners. I think they're all the scanners, if I'm not mistaken, who
Mhm.
discover that someone has figured out a way to travel through space that allows people to do it safely, and so that the scanners are no longer needed. And the scanners all kind of meet together and they make a decision that what they want to do is kill this person before this information gets out.
Right.
And the person who's the hero of the story, Martel, is someone who is cranching right now. So he's at home. His emotions are inside of his body rather than just having a kind of rational connection to his body. And so he goes to this meeting. They know he's cranching, and no one else is because it's just not very common. And normally, if you were, you wouldn't come to the meeting, but they insist he come. And he's horrified by this. He realizes that this is the wrong thing to do, that they once they come back and cranch, they'll be appalled by what they've done, but also that it's not good for the scanners. And so he decides he needs to prevent this. So first he tries to do it by voting against it. He tries to kind of speak to the other scanners. He's not getting through with anyone. So he decides to go figure out a way to go to the house of the person who's invented this new process and try to warn him and try to save him. He does that. He becomes convinced that the person does have a process that will make this happen, that it's kind of revolutionary. And then as he's talking to him, the other scanner shows up who is intending to kill this guy, whose last name is Stone. Is it Adam Stone? I can't remember offhand.
It's
I think
Adam,
so.
I think. Yeah.
Adam, yeah.
Definitely Adam. I didn't, I'm not sure if his last name was Stone, but it's definitely
Is it?
Adam. But go
I
ahead.
think it's Stone, but maybe I made that up because I just wanted to be Stone. Um, and so he shows up. The things that the scanners have is they can kind of change their body process. They can kind of accelerate them or slow them down. And so he's kind of accelerated himself to the point where he's moving so quickly that he's almost invisible to his victim. And which also puts him at a point where he's very close to collapse, this person who wants to kill him. Martel does the same thing, ends up preventing the death by turning one of his controls on the of the person who's trying to kill him and kills him. And then it's so exhausting for him, he collapses. When he wakes up, he's fully back in his body. He's gone through a process of being kind of reinserted fully into his body. Everything is starting to change. No one realizes that he has killed this person. They think that he has, that both Martel and this other person have come to warn Adam. And so he's kind of, cleared of that. And yeah, and then the scanners are being taken out of their bodies, kind of putting back into their bodies and are going to participate in space travel in a different way. So,
And all the prisoners killed.
and all the prisoners are going to be killed. There is that as well, which I think that Cordwainer Smith knows what he's doing with that in terms of like, there's a certain irony with that
Right.
as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
Mhm. Now, Duncan, you were not familiar with this story. Did you have any idea it was written in 1945?
Um, I did because I think in the copy I got, it's in there.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this is quite an amazing science fiction story for 1945. It's not to say that there wasn't really out there great science fiction by that point. There was starting to be some for at that point, but probably the most famous science fiction author, or the most popular at the time, was A.E. von Vogt, probably, right? And this is pretty out there science fiction for 1945. Um, Now, going back and rereading this, Brian, for you, for me, I kept thinking about the fact when I was rereading it this time, holy shit, this is 1945 that he
Mhm.
was writing this. I mean, this is pretty advanced science fictional ideas, right? And I think that's one of the things that separates this story at this early stage. I don't know how you feel about that, but just the very concept of the scanners, or that there would, I mean, we're not even a decade from being able to
Yeah,
put a person in orbit, and he's thinking about deep space travel and
yeah.
these weird effects. I don't know how you feel about how early it is.
I mean, I do think it feels very early in a lot of ways. I mean, you're right. I mean, there's people who are starting to do interesting things. Honestly, it's like I do the thing with science fiction where the stuff I love I read kind of very thoroughly, like
Yeah.
read all the writers, but there's probably a lot of gaps in my knowledge. But my feeling is that it's pretty advanced. It's doing this thing where you can argue that it's hard science fiction, but also like it's so much of it is he doesn't explain much, you know, and so it kind of it works in this conceptual way where he's able to get away with a lot more perhaps with that
Mhm.
because we don't know how this process is working that kind of gets them, except that there's a big kind of wire that's used to kind of make some of this happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And the story that I always kind of think about when I read this is Chip Delaney's story, Samuel R. Delaney's story,
Mhm.
I and Gomorrah, who's someone that both Duncan and I owe a little bit. And it has a similar thing where it's people who are kind of they're changed and become kind of non-human in relation to how they function in their ships as they kind of operate. But that was written probably 20 years later, something like that.
Yeah.
So it in that sense it does feel pretty advanced to me.
Well, the science fiction story of the year when this came out, the most popular and amazing, was The World of Nale by A.E. von Vogt, which, of course, um, uh, my dickheads out there will be very familiar with, because that was one of Phil's favorite novels growing up, and was the
Mm,
pastiche he was kind of, shall we say, homaging with his first novel, Solar Lottery. So, the World of Nale is very important for there. But if you read World of Nale, it has roboplanes, and it's on Venus, and it's
hmm
very 40s. Whereas I don't think you can read this story and automatically know, if you don't know the date, I wouldn't know which decade it was written
hmm
in. Whereas World of Nale, I can tell it was a 40s story when I read it, as
Yeah.
a somebody who's really learned on this. But now I really want to get into Duncan's point of view, because Duncan, this was a first time read for you. You hadn't read Cordwainer Smith before, and you just had your old friend email you and say, read this weird story. What was your first impression while reading Scanners Live in Vain?
At the first two sentences, which are pretty famous at this point, I was laughing because I was like, and actually in my horror literature class, I was talking to my students about um, the way language moves between genres, and I was saying like science fiction often has sentence structuring that is like would never fly in some other genre, right? A kind of unique sonic footprint. And that second including line of he moved his blood away, you're just like, okay, all right, we're getting something here. And for me, what I really liked about it is like, readers are going to be frustrated with the first few pages, but then, you know, he does a good job of filling in all the mystery. for the large part. You don't get the mechanics of how things work and maybe a hard sci-fi, but you definitely get the answers you mostly need. And I mean, I could say that there is a lot of answers given in dialogue in a
Yeah.
very unique way that I was like, I don't know if I love this, but uh, it was interesting, and luckily
It
I
was
read
his second story.
yeah, yeah, I read a lot of weird stuff, so it wasn't like,
Right.
I'd only read Virginia Woolf and this blew my mind.
Mm, mm.
Well, and it is interesting because I do think he definitely, as somebody who's read more of his work,
Mhm,
I think this is an early story of his, and I do think he got better at a lot of things. But the raw energy of Scanner's Live in Vain is really great
mhm,
because this is a second time. This is an early writer like um, going for it, you know, and I do think that's I don't know. I mean, how do you feel, Brian, as somebody who's read all of it?
Um, yeah, I mean, I like it as a kind of early story of his. It's to be honest, it's not my favorite story of his, even though I think it's an important story. I think it's an interesting story. But there's some stuff later that gets a lot weirder as
Yeah.
well, and you start to see the weirdness coming out here. But I think you and I have talked before. There's a story he wrote called A Planet Called Shale, which is about a weird prison planet and where people do things like they're punished by having multiple heads grow off and things like that. And it just gets so weird. And I think the story that China first talked about with me was The Dead Lady of Clowntown. I think that's the title, which also is very weird and also very political at the same time. Um, and so one of the funny things about reading this story again, it's like I find myself back filling what I think of the later stuff into this, and thinking, all right, like things like what we were talking about before with the fact that all the prisoners are just killed. I mean, I
mhm,
feel like I know enough about his later work that I'm like, oh yeah, there's an ethics behind that he's just not, he doesn't approve of this exactly. But I think there's a lot of stories from the 40s that you could read someone and you think, oh yeah, they're okay with this.
mhm,
So
Well, and unlike a lot of stories from this era, because it was written for kind of a low publication or low distribution zine, he wasn't as affected by the editorial fuckery that a lot of the Campbell stories were affected by, the ones that were published by Campbell and the like. And for that reason, I think he had a little bit more freedom to be weird and
mhm,
and
yeah.
and do his thing. But yeah, I really appreciate his world building too is just really fantastic. I don't know, I know I already mentioned the Confucius thing, but I think the way he allows the reader to um kind of figure these things out is really great.
Yeah,
And
and Duncan's right. He gives you enough that like if you can make it through the first few pages, you're there eventually. You have enough to kind of hold on to.
yeah, and one of the best first pieces of short story advice I was given was, I don't even remember who said this to me, but they kept saying, well, like all your stories start on the third page.
mhm,
um, because you're always trying to give too much information or set too much when you're a young writer a lot of times. And then somewhere along the line, you figure out you just have to start the story where the story starts instead of like trying to, you know, people will come along to those things. And I think Scanners Live in Vain is a very great example of you, if you're patient enough with the story to
Mhm.
uh,
mhm.
to come along with it, you'll be rewarded.
Yeah.
So
Mhm,
I guess I want to talk about the cranching for a minute. And uh, there was a degree that we get into some kind of horrific things with the cranching and the way it's almost body horror. I'm wondering, Duncan, as somebody who teaches horror fiction, what did you think about the way the body is kind of talked about in this story?
Um, well, first of all, I laugh because I call one of my cats a little scraunch. And so when I saw this, I just started laughing and had trouble pulling my cat out of the story. But uh, I thought it was very interesting. I thought about it in the way that the way he holds back in his descriptions, and the way that, sometimes it's phrased like you want to think it's just two eyeballs floating around, and that difference between the body and the being was pretty fascinating. And I just kind of I at times I had a little trouble visualizing it, like understanding exactly how much human there was there, um, and what the box looked like on the chest, and um, yeah. So, and scratching's where you're like, that's the one where you take the needle and you get into your senses, right?
Yeah,
So
it's
your
the
senses
cranching
return.
is when you get your senses back.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was fascinating. Really just kind of this idea of being separate from emotion was a really fascinating concept. And
Yeah.
what kind of decisions you can make in that way, uh, that would be impossible to decide with a conscience. But if you look at the greater good of things, and that's your only decision, and you don't feel remorse about it, then, there's a purity there.
Well, and it's a whole decade before we started having people making these giant sacrifices to be the first to go into space, right? And so, like, that's one thing I kept thinking about was once people were, if you think about like the Mercury astronauts, for example, like it was a painful, brutal process, like getting into orbit in those little tiny tin cans and doing that. And what one of the things that's so neat about this story is it's 10 years before they started, or not, maybe less than a decade, but it was, so maybe 1952 they started, those programs. But this predates that, and this idea that these people are making this huge sacrifice and doing this in order for us to travel in space was a very forward thinking concept for science fiction at the time, especially because Campbell and a lot of the editors that were working at the time wanted to glorify, science and be like, like we're dashing heroes, being Captain Future and all that. And so here's a story where it's like, dude, it really sucks going to space.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's painful.
yeah,
But there's
exactly.
but there's
And
yeah, it definitely does not go in detail into how the process works, but there's some really great visceral moments where
Mhm.
he talks, for instance, about remembering the time in which he realized he felt something wet and then realized he'd actually burned a hole in his side.
Mhm. Yeah.
right.
And I think there's a moment where he talks about checking to make sure that the people who were on the ship hadn't broken their legs because they wouldn't know if
Right.
they had or not.
Yeah,
So
and when he's like when he goes into fast forward or whatever, how
yeah,
painful that is to him. And he's just like, whoa.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and I do want to say that for the dickheads out there, I did try to find out if Phil had. Well, I'm sure he read Cordwainer Smith in the early days because he was reading all the Pulp Fiction and he was reading all that. But I checked with Bill Cyril and I checked with a lot of the people who talked with him regularly about fiction who are still with us, and nobody seemed to have like a strong memory of Phil talking about Cordwainer Smith in the later years. So I wasn't able to get any reaction on that, and I know some people will ask me that. So I did want to shout that we we do know, for example, like Tessa told us that he was very effusive of his love for Canicle for Leibowitz, for example. So we can get that information from time to time, but I could not find anything about Phil reading Cordwainer Smith. But I'm assuming that he did at some point.
Well, there's an interview where someone asks him if a scanner darkly had anything to do with Cordwainer Smith's scanners.
Oh, okay.
And he's like, he doesn't, he's like, I didn't know anyone used that title, something like that. And then
Okay.
he's like, do I have to change my title now? So there is a moment where he seems to not know him.
Yeah.
But my guess is that after that he probably went and looked just partly to make sure he wasn't, you know,
Repeating anything. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I would say that the scanner in Scanner Darkly is very different.
Oh,
uh,
for sure. Yeah.
yeah, so I don't think he had
Yeah.
anything to worry about in that sense. But um, you know, it's interesting too because you know, by the time by that time Phil wasn't really reading much science fiction anymore. He would
Hmm.
had um, so he may have not really remembered um, as much. He was mostly reading his Britannicas and writing exegesis at that point.
Hmm.
But you know, it is what it is. But yeah, I think that there are moments throughout this story that are just really powerful, like the whole
Mhm.
like the burning thing. I'm wondering if there's any that either of you um uh might want to drill down on, because for me the thing that I found really great was just the strength of the idea was one of the things that was most powerful to me about this story. Is it really got me thinking. It got me thinking about like when it was written and those concepts. So I'm worried that I some of those scenes didn't impact me quite as much because I was thinking very highly of the greater idea, I guess, is
Mhm.
what I'm saying.
The
But
thing that I
go.
thought was very interesting is despite being, and maybe it's just because we're with him while he's scratching, but maybe this doesn't occur to him when he's off the needle, but he has this guilt, right? This
Yeah.
about his wife. And I don't, I can't tell if that's just during the scratch or if it's like, or cranch rather than scratch, or if that's just like always there, but or you know what I mean, or if it's even like an ethical thing that like maybe a logical thing. He's like, well, she gets nothing out of this. How could she?
Hmm.
But I appreciated that guilt.
Right. Yeah, it's funny because I just finished Sarah Pinborough's new haunted house novel,
Mhm.
and there's a whole sub theme about the husband like coming to the realization that he's a shit husband. And I read that part right before I kind of switched over to read Scanners and Invade. So I kind of like I had this weird thematic thing with Pinborough's new novel with the shitty husbands. But I think you're right, Duncan, that comes to a really interesting thing with the characterization, because at the time, you get this impression from Mad Men and things like that that just we just had chauvinist shitty husbands like all over the place.
Hmm.
And the fact that he is thinking about like, well, this sucks for you. Um, you know,
Well,
Yeah.
and he also seems to be an exception. He's one of the few who is married, right? I mean, the
Mhm.
right.
scanners generally are not, and so that kind of suggests that there's a kind of difference to him to begin with.
Mhm.
But it's curious. He's like he does this thing where when he's courting her, he's kind of making sure she knows he's a scanner and does all this stuff, and then she marries him anyway, and he's like. Yeah, he's like on the one hand, he's like, yeah, I told her everything, and on the other hand, he's like, I feel so guilty about this. So
I I feel a bit like that being married.
Yeah,
yeah.
I
Like,
think we all do. Like,
how'd you fall for this?
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. And then you
Um,
feel guilty because they did.
yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
um, so David, correct me if I'm wrong on this. Um, but doesn't he feel guilty about the lamb chop?
The lamb chop reminds him of the smell of it reminds him of the burning bodies on one of the ships.
Okay, that's what
And
Right.
it
so
is. Okay, right,
that's why he freaks out there.
right,
And so it's not guilt so much as like the associations are just different.
And
And
right,
that
so
was
right.
a and
yeah.
that was a neat detail too, because he was just like he just didn't have any concept of what food was,
Mhm.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
in that sense, and then he's just kind of like having to have it explained to him, like um and that was a kind of a neat world building detail as well, where it's like, oh, and people eat this shit,
Yeah, that's
like,
kind of what I was getting at. He's like, wait a minute, right? Yeah, like,
yeah.
and I
Yes,
thought,
the vegan in me was definitely thinking about that, but
yeah, yeah,
yeah, where he's having that concept, and it's not as explicit as, for example, do androids dream of electric sheep, but
right,
you
right.
know, but definitely it was a neat little moment, and plays to the world building too, and I think also shows the next level, because you're right. At this time, we had a lot of the Captain Future science fiction writing, although that's kind of overplayed a little bit, because we were in the thick of the golden age,
Mhm.
the early years of the golden age, and so we were getting good science fiction at this point,
Mhm.
certainly, and also it's before Campbell had more of a he was this was early in Campbell starting to like his ethics and views and fascism kind of getting put
He
on the
wasn't
right.
asserting it quite as much.
He
Yeah.
wasn't as asserting it quite as much, and
Yeah.
right, and actually still writing decent science fiction himself.
Hmm.
Twilight, for example, a fantastic story. Not just Who Goes There. I mean, everybody knows, but Campbell was writing really good stuff in the early years before, you know,
Yeah.
But and it's interesting. Cordwainer Smith is not a guy. He's living in D.C. He's an academic down there. He's not walking around Campbell's office like Asimov and Frederick Paul and being handed ideas. He's having to write things all on his own. He's not a part of the Futurians community and all that. And by what I mean is, I mean for those who maybe don't know what I'm talking about, is like Foundation, which we think of as Asimov's seminal work, was John Campbell's idea. Like, here, Isaac, go write this. I have this idea, and I don't have the patience to sit down and write it. So you go write it, and we actually had writers in that era just like going and hanging out at his office and being given ideas to run with. And Cordwainer Smith, your James Triptree Jr. slash, AKA Alice Sheldon, a lot of these writers that were not a part of that community, they're doing a lot more original stuff because they're on their own doing this. And it should be said, there's a West Coast version of that too, with Tony Boucher, and his $1 Thursday night science fiction classes, which, by the way, I was at that house a couple weeks ago, outside stalking it like a weirdo. But in my defense, there is a plaque there, um, for but in any case, like, Cordwainer Smith was not a part of that community. He was doing this on his own, and I think that's one of the things that's really cool about this. So, on that note, so Brian, what are some other Cordwainer Smith stories that you think people should check out? Like, if they like the story and they want to read more, the one and When the People Fell is the one with the Venus space balloons, by
Hmm.
the way.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that I think are worth looking at. There's some that are very strange, like Mother. I can never remember the title of this one. Mother Hutter's Little Kittens. Mother
Look and
Hutter's.
see if that's in this
I
one, but
think it may be, but which is about a kind of defense grid, which is made by magnifying the kind of pain of these like insane weasels. And
mhm.
it's just like it's really, it's very strange. So it's hard to know exactly what to make of it, but it's pretty interesting. Mother
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 Hinton's Little Kittens.
Mother Hitton's Little Kittens. Yeah, it's really great. A planet named I said it called Shale, but it's a planet named Shale, is one that I really like. There's a series of planet pieces that you've done, all of which have kind of interesting things going on with it. The Dead Lady of Clowntown, I think, is terrific. It's a longer piece. It's a novella, and it has a kind of political thing going on with kind of under people versus kind of a ruling class that's really good. So I think those are great places to start. But really, I mean, I think if you pick up the anthology that you held up a minute ago, David, the
Yeah,
instrumentality of man, right, is what's called.
yeah. And
Yeah,
the Mother Hinton's one is in, this is a Australian collection, an Australian
yeah.
Sphere Science Fiction, which was an Australian publisher. So I don't know how the hell I ended up with this where I got it.
Yeah. There's
It
also like
happens.
there's a collected stories that I think it's from the New England Science Fiction Writers Association, and it's kind of massive. It's like 600 pages and pretty affordable. That just gets everything, and in a way you can kind of just go through and just read through it, and there's all kind of seeing how he progresses. I think is really interesting as well.
Mm.
Yeah.
So and as you can tell by the fact this was his second story, his work is pretty strong kind of from the beginning. So
Yeah, and we don't have a lot of it, so it is precious what we have,
yeah,
and we're not as lucky as Barry Malzberg we had until this year, and we had
yeah,
a whole lifetime of Barry Malzberg writing weird, messed up, fucked up science fiction, right? And Cordwainer, we have this little bit, and the Instrumentality of Mankind too has a really incredible introduction by Frederick Paul, and he tells us a whole story about how he got Frederick Paul to come out and meet other science fiction writers, and how funny it was that, like, how excited everybody fanboyed out over him showing up,
yeah.
when he did, which is pretty cool. Um, uh,
I'll tell you one more weird fact. So Norstrilia, which is the novel,
uh
which is not it's definitely worth reading, but it's not. I think the stories are better.
yeah,
But there's an Australian press that took that name Norstrilia as the name of their press, and they went on to publish uh, 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 The Plains by Gerald Burnane, really interesting Australian writer. And so there's this weird kind of connection there as well. Yeah. So Norstrilia, which is like a kind of far future version of Australia for a name,
yeah.
ended up being picked up by an Australian press that they used it for the name of their press.
A funny story too that I have one of the times I talked to Barry Malzberg, because he would, every time he would like talk about certain writers, there were certain writers he'd say things like, and he was a genius and a total bastard. And and one of the funny things about when he was talking about Cordwainer Smith is he said, he was a genius and I never met him, so I don't know if he was a bastard. Which was
That's
hilarious.
hilarious. That's great.
And so okay, Duncan, I want to the bottom line here I got to ask you is, are you interested now in checking out more Cordwainer Smith?
Yes,
You can
yeah,
be
I am.
honest.
I mean, I'm really about that Clown Town just because it's got Clown Town in it.
Hmm.
You know, anytime I get something to do with clowns or mimes, Brian,
I know. Yeah.
yeah, I want to read it instantly.
Yeah, well, it's he's such an interesting writer, and his background, I find I can't not think about it the whole time I'm reading him. Every once in a while I'm gonna be like, ooh, now see, there's his lifetime influencing this writer. I
Mhm.
I I can't help that, because I think about I'm not as lucky to know, like, with Philip K. Dick, I know where he was living when he wrote each story. So
Right.
that's kind of too far, but
Hmm.
you
Yeah,
know,
no, I had a similar experience. Laird Hunt let me borrow The Investigation by Stanislaw Lem, and then I just like read everything. I
Right.
could, and wanted to know everything about that author.
Mm.
But I think, yeah, I'm definitely gonna hop on here and get this collection,
Mm.
check it out. Because unfortunately, most of the sci-fi I read is written by undergrads.
Yeah.
That can happen if you teach. Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and Ray Naylor, when he was on here, I quote this all the time because I think it's the best humble brag that I've ever had on the podcast. Is he just kind of ran and he's like, well, when I read Stanislaw Lem, I try to read them in Russian, so it's as close to the original language as possible. And then we had him on Dickheads to talk about like, what made Stanislaw Lem better in Russian, and it
Mhm.
was fascinating because he got into some really gritty details about how his world building is so much more powerful um, in a Slavic language, and I found that very fascinating. But
I'll have to ask Elisa. My wife's from Russia.
well, yeah, maybe she can highlight that to us too. It's funny because I think Lem is one of those authors who just is in a class of his own, and those are a lot
He's
of the
great. Yeah. He's
best
really
Yeah.
good.
science fiction writers.
Mhm.
So Brian, do you have anybody else, since last time it was Cordwainer Smith you highlighted to me? Is there anybody you can throw at us?
I'm trying to think of what if I've read anything lately that really has blown me away. Nothing that comes kind of immediately to mind. I mean, I'm sure there's something out there that I'm. Oh yeah, I mean there is in terms of contemporary stuff.
Mhm.
Thomas Ha, his new book, which is called Uncertain Suns, is his first book. It's coming out with Michael Kelly's press. In Canada. It's a book of stories, and it's kind of weird fiction with a science fictional edge. First, it's his, yeah, as I said, it's his first book. I thought that book was pretty good. So
Now I got to ask you, Brian, have you ever read the Chinese writer Han Sung? Like,
I have not, I don't think. Yeah.
now see, I in my review I said that he's like a Chinese Brian Evenson. And I compared him to you, and I found out that my comparison comparing him to you got translated in one on like a cover of an edition over there, which
Oh, that's great.
blew my mind. But
I'll look at him. I'll have to look at him now that I
you
know
have
that
to
Now you
because
have to.
that I have a doppelganger. Yeah.
yeah, he's a very strange, surreal, like weird sci-fi horror-ish.
Oh, and now that you say that, I mean the thing that I read that I loved, Bora Chang, do you know Bora Chung, sorry, her
I
work?
have her collection on my TBR
Yeah.
right now.
I mean it's all good. There's a new one that's coming out, but a new collection. But she has a novel called Red Sword, which is very weird it's, science fiction and pretty interesting Korean science fiction. A lot of weird kind of body stuff that you kind of figure out as you go along. So,
Now on the Han Sung, he has their Eric Guignard's press has a primer for his short fiction.
oh,
That
okay,
was the
cool.
one that I
Ah,
reviewed where I said he's like a Chinese Brian
and
Evenson.
so the primer, does that end up having including a bunch of the stories or?
Yeah, it has a bunch of his short stories. It's the most translated stories of his that you can get.
Ah, okay,
Eric.
cool. I will
But
check
he's
it out.
been in all the Ken Liu Chinese
Right.
science fiction.
Well, so maybe I have read a story or two along the way, but I'll check and make sure. But yeah, that's great. I'm glad to know about him.
Yeah, and the best of those, I don't know, Zhang Hing Fang, um, how I'm probably butchering her name, but she's a science fiction writer from China who won the Hugo for the Folding Beijing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
she has one called the Jump Knots that's very good too.
Okay,
Um,
cool.
yeah,
Mhm.
I'm very big fan of, but I'm a big fan of the Chinese science fiction. But anyways, well, listen, you guys have giving me a lot of your time. Let's do a little bit about what your current works are. Let's Duncan, let's talk a little bit about Awry. This is your most recent book. It's a fantastic short story collection.
Thank you.
Probably Fine Set of Teeth is the one that really got me. But I like Flesh and Fur and The Father's Work were all very powerful works. You want to tell folks about this book?
I'm really terrible at that. Um, it's I wasn't planning to have a collection. I was wrapping up a novel, and Caleb reached out to me and said, "Hey, I'm not liking any of the submissions I'm getting right now. Do you have something?" And I said, "Oh, I'll pull together some short stories." So I had to kind of go through all these things that have been lingering on my hard drive over the years and try to figure out a shape for them, and left a lot out that didn't quite fit. But yeah, I think the oldest one is not the father's work, the Fine Set of Teeth.
Mhm.
Yeah, I wrote that at DU.
Well, there is one paragraph in that one that made me squirm, and that is hard to do. So,
Well, I have to say, I mean, that story was absolutely influenced by Watson's Boy by Brian.
Oh, it's nice of you to say.
The idea of like navigating those dark spaces.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
mm.
It's a good story. I really like that story.
You're like, has great influence.
Right now, yeah, now that I know it's tied to my story, I really
I
like
suddenly
that story.
love that story.
Yeah, that's right.
Brian, what's your you've been in Berlin writing? Did you
Yeah.
what do we have to look forward to?
Well, so I was working on the novel over there that was kind of a literary novel that's a sequel to a book I wrote called The Open Curtain. And
Nice.
I got a certain ways along with that, but then at a certain point I was like, I really want to write a possession novel. And so I'm about halfway through that and about halfway through a possession novel in which is, weird and absurd and, non-typical in a lot of ways.
Nice.
But I'm not far enough with either to know that one's coming out all that soon. But the next book's going to be a book called Phantom Limb, which is a sequel to
Ooh,
Last Days,
Okay.
and
nice.
and that has appeared in France already, and it got good press there. It's going to come out in Italy as well, and it's set to come out in Prague. And it'll probably come out in all three of those places before it comes out in the US, just because it won't come out in the US till about a year from now, I think. So,
Well, we have much to look forward to on that. Last Days
Yeah.
was my first Evenson.
mm.
So, and which Duncan, did I tell you that story about how I went to you did a signing with Jamia Jefferson
Oh
at
yeah,
Powell's when I was
God, that
living
was
in
a long time ago. I
Portland.
forgot about that. Yeah,
And I admit I had never heard of you before that day, Brian. And I went for
it's okay.
Jamia, and I saw Brian shopping in Powell's, and I went back and told my wife, I was like, I saw the other guy reading, and he had a bunch of rad stuff in his basket. So I think he's gonna be pretty good.
That's
And
awesome.
I was I saw you in the horror section with a basket full of stuff. So
Sounds right. Sounds right.
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
that was my first experience. So pretty cool. But
Uh,
yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. Last Days is one of my favorites. So on
Thank
that
you.
note, folks, hey, we did it. The Science Fiction Hall of Fame is back. Next month, you have to look forward to Ray Bradbury's Mars is Heaven.
Mm.
Uh,
mm,
and I'm not sure who the guests are going to be, but I know I promised my buddy Judge Mark Rothenberg from Indianapolis, who I do my best reads of the year with every year, that he could be on the Ray Bradbury episode. So he'll be there. And then speaking of Indianapolis, that's where the Ray Bradbury Center is. And so I'm probably going to invite Dr. Ackerman from the Ray Bradbury Center. Makes sense. So I'll drop him an email. Have you ever, have either of you been to the Ray Bradbury Center in Indianapolis?
No, it sounds
Mhm.
interesting though.
Yeah, so this guy who wrote 5 biographies of Ray Bradbury was a professor at IUPUI, and so he somehow convinced Ray Bradbury to donate everything to him, and they moved his entire office from LA to Indianapolis and recreated it in the basement of the Ray Bradbury Center in Indianapolis. And so you can sit at his writing desk, look at his paintings. They use pictures to put all the books up in the same insane order that they're there. They have all of his papers. They have a original VHS of Something Wicked This Way Comes before it got cut.
Hmm.
It's amazing, and it's in Indianapolis, so you can do a totally nerdy road trip to Indianapolis. You can go to the Ray Bradbury Center, the Kurt Vonnegut Museum, and then go down to Bloomington, of course.
Hmm.
Brian, you were there at the
Lilly Library.
Lilly
Yeah.
Library,
Mhm.
where you can touch a lock of Edgar Allan Poe's hair. You
Yep.
can look at a first edition of Frankenstein, and Tony Boucher's papers are down there.
Hmm.
So you can do all that in my home state of Indiana. And by the way, when you were at the Lilly Library, you were walking distance, 5 minutes, about 5-10 minutes to my house that I grew up in.
Oh, good to know. Good to know. If I'm ever back there, I'm going to track down your house.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Lilly Library is amazing. I don't think people have. I held an original manuscript of Goldfinger when I was there.
Oh, wow, cool.
Yeah, but and that being said, and one last thing I want to announce to everyone: next year we have the Philip K. Dick Festival coming up in Fullerton. And speaking of manuscripts, we're going to have a pop-up museum because it's the week before Worldcon in Anaheim. So we're going to do a pop-up museum, and one of the things you can do is get a look at the original Dune manuscripts, for example, and Man in the High
Hmm.
Castle is there,
Hmm.
and a lot of cool things in the papers. And we're going to have all kinds of collectors donating their materials to be in the pop-up museum. So if you like seeing doing this Indiana Jones shit with the literature, we're gonna have you. But a lot of fun stuff coming up for the Philip K. Dick Festival, and it's way overdue that we brought it back to California. So where Phil lived, wrote, and died. So on that note, folks, we'll see you next time. Duncan, where can people find your work?
Stores?
Stores?
But I am doing Elise has got me doing a TikTok right now, and I've been doing micro classes of horror theory on TikTok.
I've
That
been
seemed to be,
loving that. That has been
yeah,
great. I've been really
yeah, those
enjoying
have been
that.
fun. But you can order it at the major bookstores, but you know, it's not as widely available as a lot of books.
All right.
Mhm.
Well, I definitely think people should seek it out. And of course, Duncan, you're always welcome on this podcast, and I will definitely have you back for other things. Brian, where can folks find your stuff?
I mean, I would say also in stores, but yeah. If you're in LA, Skylight Books is usually has my work,
Mhm.
and yeah, there's other a lot of independent bookstores have been very supportive. But yeah, if you walk into a Barnes and Noble, then it's you've got to really get a 6 on the dice to find my books there.
Well, yeah, it's I will say the right Barnes and Noble with the right person
That's very true.
nowadays.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, oh, what's the name of the woman that in South Dakota that does the amazing stuff at the Barnes and Nobles? She carries all the indie horror, and it's great.
Mhm.
Like
Oh, that's good.
it's weird
Yes.
because Duncan, I have a bunch of readers in South Dakota because of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I never that was something I did not expect. That I'd have people writing me from about Punk Rock Ghost Story from from
Yeah. Right.
this random South Dakota Barnes and Nobles. It's great.
I've never had the opportunity to be there. So I've not met her.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, it's cool that they have been empowering people, and of course, we're lucky at Clash. They carry all of our stuff. So
Cool.
for those of us Clash authors, we're very lucky on that. And I appreciate that. And folks, I've got a new novel, Great America and Dead World. It's my experimental novel. I use the PKD formula to write a novel.
Mhm.
Yes, I'm the guy with that hubris, but you can see if you think I pulled it off or not. Check it out. It also has an essay in the back about how it was conceived, and I hope that that is worth it enough for people too. So on that note, it was really awesome seeing both of you. And if you made it this far, listeners, you're troopers, and we'll see you in I think our next episode of Postcards is going to be breaking down season 3 of Strange New Worlds, and spoiler alert, I hated it, so you're going to want to come back and see this Trekkie get really angry about a season of Star Trek, and see if Sarah defends it or not. I don't know if moving to Europe has softened. Well, she's usually the one that defends everything that I don't like. So, but the next episode should be the Strange New Worlds season end breakdown with my bridge crew, Isa from Good Clean Fun and Sarah Lynn Mishner. So we'll see you folks next time for that. And thank you to my guests for joining us. And we'll see you next time on Postcards from a Dying World. As always, folks, keep reading and spreading the word. Indie authors need your help. Word of mouth is the most important thing. So thank you very much.
Thank you.